All right, we are live. So before we get started, I'm just going to say a couple words from our sponsors at New Society. So New Society Publishers is proud to be celebrating 40 years of activist, solutions-based oriented publishing. From the roots in non-violent civil disobedience training during the Vietnam War to today, they continue to bring positive solutions and cutting-edge ideas to some of the most troubling challenges of our time. Committing to building an ecologically sustainable and just society, they walk their talk by printing their books in North America, never overseas, and on 100% post-consumer recycled paper. They are carbon neutral and have been since 2006. Their employees are all shareholders and they are a certified B corporation. If you want to find out more about New Society and what they're up to, head to www.newsociety.com. And today I have a very special guest, actually two very special guests, Michelle Avis and Dr. Peter Coombes. Michelle likely doesn't need an introduction to you, but either way, Michelle is the co-author of Essential Rainwater Harvesting and the co-founder of both Verge Permaculture and Adaptive Habitat. And Peter Coombes, or Dr. Peter Coombes rather, is a systems thinker, scientist, engineer, economist, and the director of Urban Water Solutions, which provides strategic design, education on urban, rural, and natural water cycles and systems, and policy and economic advice to an eclectic array of clients, including the United Nations. Furthermore, Peter has been involved in the design and development of over 120 sustainable developments in Australia and elsewhere. He's the author of over 150 research publications and is the Associate Dean at the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Southern Cross University in Lismore, Australia. Welcome, Michelle and Peter, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mitch. Before we get going, Peter, I spoke with Mitch a little bit before the call today after he'd reviewed your bio to introduce you, and he said to me, Michelle, Peter is probably one of the smartest guys I've ever had the opportunity to interview. He's done a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely the longest introduction I've done.
Oh, you're too kind, Mitch. In my household, I'm the last of the pecking order after the Golden Retrievers.
Well, either way, it's quite the track record you have. And first things first, I'm wondering if you could please just shed some light on your journey. In particular, it'd be awesome to hear how you got so involved in rainwater and your journey with urban water cycle solutions.
Sure. I thought you'd start with Michelle, so you'd take the heat off me. But it's an interesting science question whether small things at a distributed scale, at every household or every building, for example, that's a distributed scale, how much value and benefit they make to, say, a city scale or a biosphere or our climate system. And it's a research question that's got me out of bed in the mornings for longer than 30 years. So it's always been assumed that small things don't make any difference, that it doesn't matter, but the principles of sustainability are about doing more locally to change the impacts on our global systems. And when you think like that, you're also thinking about, well, everyone doing their bit should make life better for everyone else. And they're two principles that have kept me going. So I grew up in the outback of Australia, where our only source of water was rainwater, and we conserved water, and we had a different way of living with water because it was immensely valuable, because if you didn't have it, you couldn't live there. And that was in an arid climate. So when I moved into the research industry, there were people saying to me that, well, look, these things don't work. So I was researching other things like, how water utilities behave and energy utilities and things like that. But they kept saying to me, oh, you can't do rainwater harvesting or solar panels or local solutions because, don't bother, it doesn't work. So, well, hang on, I lived in the outback and we supplied our own energy and our own water, and it did work. The worst possible environment. So I think the conventional wisdom has a problem. So that started my research journey and some arguments with my PhD supervisor as well. When I said I wanted to create systems models of everything to find out the value of small things, he said, "Oh no, why would you bother?" But I did. So I'm a systems scientist because traditional methods that are based on centralized top-down analysis actually don't show us the value of anything small. An example of this is when we were thinking about carbon trading, which we should have done in Australia. Our Treasury was modelling all of the big things like the energy utilities and so on, but they didn't model households in their economic models. The biggest contribution to reducing our carbon footprint was the way people in houses and buildings change the way they use energy. So by changing their behavior, by changing the way the types of appliances they use, and by also getting solar panels and now solar batteries. And these were a massive behind the meter is the utility argument for this type of contribution that was not counted in our carbon response. And it was a fairly massive response. There's a blip in the market when we had this carbon trading messages and households did the heavy lifting. The same happens in water. So, sorry, a long story, Mitch, but it's a profound research question that I've been working on for 30 years. And what is the value of everything else we do in society to make the world a better place?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I love the small. I mean, I'm in the course right now, the on demand, and so I've actually listened to you talk quite a lot, and I love the systems thinking approach. Especially, I find some parallels between this and some geomorphic stuff too, because in geomorphology, it's the small scale events that really change the course of a river. It's not these big scale events that is pretty common in a lot of societies in the way that they think. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of parallel in different systems.
I think if I could be rude enough to take some of Michelle's time, sorry, Michelle, but geomorphology is a classic example of where the common wisdom is the big events actually make the big geomorphic changes. But that's not true at all.
Yeah.
It's all the little events who make the imperceptible event by event changes that are irreversible. And it's a good example, Mitch.
Yeah. All right, Michelle, your turn. How did you get so into rainwater?
How did we get into rainwater? Well, I mean, as an engineer and a permaculture designer, we've always been drawn to all these different ways of meeting our own needs for energy or for water or for waste or for food, right? And then when Rob and I traveled to Australia, it was really interesting what a different culture there is there around rainwater. You know, no one, about 10 years ago when we were looking into rainwater harvesting, people harvested rain in barrels for their garden, but the idea of collecting rain for indoor or drinking water use is pretty much non-existent in where we come from. So to see, hardware stores with full aisles of specialty items for indoor rainwater use was really eye-opening and actually had me thinking for the first time, why don't we do more of this? So we started, got back home, started looking up what there was in the Canadian landscape for who was harvesting rainwater, what did the regulatory bodies have to say about it, what were the codes and standards around rainwater harvesting. Started putting in our own system, and eventually we're approached by New Society publishers to write a book for their essential, what is the name of the series?
It's essential. It's essential home. Sustainable building essentials.
Sustainable building essentials. And when we kind of, and when we thought about the topics that interested us, we thought we could tackle this rainwater harvesting. And so we did. And in doing the research for it, I stumbled across Peter's fabulous body of research and reached out to him. That was almost 2.5 years ago now, Peter, hard to believe. And you answered our email and were kind enough and willing to have a conversation with us. And then it just unfolded from there. You gave us a technical review on the book. We were able to incorporate some, if not a lot of your research, not all of it actually, because we were kind of really close to publication at the time we came across Peter. But Peter and I went on to work together on building a course based on his research and the best practices that his research team discovered for rainwater harvesting. And we ran that course for the first time last year, and we're actually ramping up to run that course again here in January. So that's in part why we're getting together to chat rainwater. Because
Awesome.
we're really excited about running. Actually, it's really, last year was the beta run for the course. This would be the first official rainwater harvesting course collaboration with Peter and ourselves, Verge.
Awesome. And I think, I mean, given some recent events, especially to our neighbors to the south, that might actually generate a lot of interest. A lot of people watching may or may not know, but some would say California, which if it was absolutely independent, they'd have the 5th largest economy in the world. But they're in a mega drought right now. And this year, during peak temperatures and during a raging wildfire season, they announced that water futures are going to be traded on Wall Street. And Peter, I'm wondering, and Michelle, what your interpretation of this is, if it's something we should be quite concerned about, the implications of this, and maybe other instances where there have been other things on Wall Street that didn't go all that well for people, or maybe an instance where it was actually beneficial.
So I'd love to comment on that, Mitch. So the market doesn't solve everything, but the market actually defines the value for things. The problem is around commodities markets or any type of economic market, it's a question of whose value and where is this value. We had the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, and we had some high-profile economists saying, oh, well, we just send water to the highest value use and we'll create commodities trading in water, which we've been doing for over a decade. And I think there's an exchange in Singapore, for example. So, it's very formalized. Markets are not magic. Adam Smith's magic hand has been disproven since. So those who don't know the history of economics is Adam Smith produced the concept of the magic hand is just the market process fixes everything and everything will be okay. But some really good economists later, some of which won Nobel Prizes, including Joseph Stiglitz, found that this was not the case. Markets only do what you design them to do, and they usually benefit those who manage them or those who design them. So the upside of commodities trading in water futures is water is always undervalued. It will find a value for water, but water itself is a paradox. Even in these markets, it doesn't really have a value all of its own. It has a value around who owns it or what infrastructure conveys it. And it's more about the impounding infrastructure and the infrastructure used to move water around. So really these markets are surrogates for water infrastructure or water ownership. So what happened in Australia is we had lots of water licenses in our big rural area, the Murray-Darling Basin, and many of those water rights were not fully used because the farmers are good stewards of our land for the most part. But then when there were futures trading in water, so futures trading is like gambling. You're saying, I'm going to invest X amount of dollars in saying that the price of water will be $1,000 a kiloliter in 2025. And it's like hedge fund arrangements. So you're actually gambling on futures. So you're gambling, there are long and short investments. So you're gambling on whether the value will be higher and lower. But that sort of market approach where people have got nothing to do with water or are just using water as a commodity to increase value of their investment and therefore use that to increase the value of their portfolio are not the farmers in the basin, and they have no relationship to water often. They're just often bankers or commodity traders, and they're just trying to get a margin out of their investment in water. So that drives up the price of water. What that does on the ground, because it's completely not related to what the reality of water, how you're using it, what benefit it gives to you. It's just a separate process of investing in water to get more dollar value out of it in a commodities market. So what that does on the ground, if you're driving up the price of water for investment of other people who are unrelated to the environment and maybe the agricultural sector you're in, it actually drives up the price. So it means that the farmers now who have water licenses, they're now worth, for example, that water now has a higher value. So they're actually forced to use that water, where in the past they weren't. They were forced to make that water work hard. In doing so, it's a process known in economics as crowding out. It crowds out all other thinking about the environment or what's the best time to use the water. It forces a maximization of the use. So every bit of water, every drop is used. And that actually then creates sub-markets where people are saying, how do I get around the rules so I can use more of this water because it's become so highly priced? So we've had this problem for sure in Australia, where we had floodplain harvesting and all sorts of other arrangements that are outside of the rules that are actually pulling more water out of the basin that can't afford it. So this can be avoided by good management of a commodities trading scheme, but then you get into the idealism of the markets solve everything versus the Keynesian economics approach. The markets only do something when you carefully design them and intervene in them to make sure they behave in the way you need them. So I suspect the Californians are going to have an interesting future, particularly their history with commodities trading and energy around Enron in the past.
Yeah, so were there any good lessons learned from that Enron experience that kind of changed the legislature? I mean, I'm certainly not familiar with California legislature, and I'm not sure how familiar you are, but were there any changes made that you know of that could mitigate such a, I guess, not very desirable behavior of humans to happen again?
Well, all countries of the world have antitrust legislation, which is designed to keep their markets honest. But you need to go one step further into Keynesian economics to have the courage to intervene in a market when it's going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. So one of the outcomes of water is, you can say, a market can start to, and it's already happened in California, it would be unintentionally, let's say, be skewed towards benefiting one stakeholder in the market, say the water utility at the bottom of the catchment. So California already had that, where no one else was allowed to use water in the catchment. so that all the water flowed down the river to the water company, so they could sell the water. So, and we had this problem also in South Africa. It meant many other people who could use the water where it falls, where it had the least impact on the environment and society, and the economy, could have an existence, and everyone could share in that market together. That's it's an oligopoly process where there's one big player, but lots of small players. But there's already legislation in California that basically limits other people in the watershed or the catchment from using water, so that the water utility at the bottom of the watershed or catchment can actually supply the water. So that gives us a really strange situation where I'm household X, I'm in the top of the watershed, some rain falls on my property, let's harvest that. I'm not using the water, therefore, from the water utility system, so I'm using some of the rainfall that falls in the catchment. Some relatively independent, partially or fully, so local action to produce a global benefit. But you can get legislation that says is skewed towards the biggest player in the market, the water utility, and you get this perverse outcome where it says, no, you can't use that water because that must flow down the river and be harvested down the bottom of the catchment, and that water will then be treated and pumped and piped all the way back up the hill to the top of the watershed to that person who wasn't allowed to use it. So economically, one could cost 100 times more than the other, because letting it flow down the river and then extracting it, treating it, and pumping it back up the hill across long distances to the house that could have actually simply just used the water that falls on it is a really perverse outcome, and it's quite common. And I gave a keynote.
Isn't that what's driving a lot of the rules around not being able to harvest rainwater? It's this kind of thinking, especially
It certainly is, Michelle. And the Australian experience is the utilities and the government departments tried to claim that the state or the Commonwealth owned the water and the rain, so no one was allowed to use it because the state owned it. But the state also owns its own water companies, so there was skewed decision making. So actually, fortunately, it was defeated in Australia, where what falls on your property is owned by you. If you're on a rural property, there are limits about you can't harvest all of it, or else there'd be no water for anyone else. It's called in old English law, it's their property rights and riparian rights, which are river rights. But you can't unduly disadvantage your neighbour around water. So,
but Peter, how does this all tie back to futures trading? Because I can see how, these kind of things could still be in place without water being treated as a commodity, right? Just this in general, trying to support this large scale infrastructure, and then a general belief that these centralized systems are more efficient and more cost effective than all these distributed small scale solutions, which really is the prevalent belief in what I see in North America, right? There's this big lawmakers and politicians and even people tend to think that it's more cost effective and better for society to have one central system than all these distributed systems, which, as you were saying earlier, was really where you started your research, questioning if that was indeed the case, right? So then can you help me tie the link back to water as a, this recent news and futures?
So we already have that problem we were talking about around watersheds and catchments being managed in a way that Just people can't use the water that falls on them in the top of the watersheds, so that it all flows to some centralized provider, usually a government monopoly, based on the concept as the centralized solution is better. That's already in place. That's a good point, Michelle. The open question is, if you go to commodity trading on futures, what, and remembering I said that water has no intrinsic value in the way we use markets at the moment, it's valued around the infrastructure we use to manage water, really. So the biggest investors will want to invest in the big centralized infrastructure, and that will drive the commodities trading. The small investors are maybe mums and dads on their farm who want to make a difference to the world, and accumulatively they would, because they are our citizenship, they are our catchment. Our catchment and our watersheds are built from the bottom up. They're every single house and every single property, every single farm, whatever. So if everyone does something differently at a distributed scale, household scale, say harvest rainwater, you're actually dramatically changing the need to supply centralized supplies, and you're actually dramatically changing the impact on your water resources in the environment and the energy required to move water around. So California uses, I think, more energy than anywhere else in the world to move water around. So you're changing your carbon footprint. So when you think more holistically, but your point, Michelle, is quite right. How will it change that? Well, if the market was constructed in a way that acknowledges the market is really driven by the small parts, and the most of the players are little players on their properties, and there was some clever market design, I think we could get quite beneficial commodity trading, because you would fully account for the deferred expense to the state from, say, a bunch of homeowners harvesting rainwater, and that would be a very large value. We found this in Australia, like Sydney Water selling water for $2 a kilolitre, whilst also charging you $1,000 a year fixed charges or something like that, or 500 when you count sewage. But the reality is, in parts of the greater Sydney region in Australia, the true cost of providing that water is almost $30 a kilolitre. So the difference between 2 and 30, sorry, I'm getting into trading now. So all that Sydney Water is getting for their water is, say, $2 a kilolitre, but it's costing them $30 a kilolitre to supply some area. So if you say, no, I don't need that supply because I'm going to supply most of it myself, or rainwater or water efficient appliances, or maybe some grey water, you're actually saving the central utility 20 minus 2, which is $18 a kilolitre of water supply. So if a market can actually account for that, it would drive very different outcomes around energy and water, because we can't separate water from energy.
Can I try and paraphrase? Because I think this is really important, and this is something I see come up all the time. Even just, we're teaching a permaculture design course right now, and just did the topic of water. And one of the students asked, how much is it going to cost me to change my current system over to rainwater? And the reality is, you know, they're in an urban environment. They have 100% municipal water supply, and the water's not very expensive. It's quite cost effective. So the idea of putting in all the infrastructure, especially in a cold climate where you would have to probably put in an underground tank, is substantial for them to be able to start harvesting and utilizing rainwater in their home. And it's so cost prohibitive to make that retrofit that it's not even worth considering. And so I think, just to try and take that tangible example and bring it back to what you're saying, is you're implying that on the municipal scale, the reality is the cost that we're being charged, especially in urban centers, for water is is not at all representative of the true cost of that water being delivered. And if it's basically being subsidized in all these different ways. And this is what your research has shown. You mentioned the $2 per liter in Sydney is what the cost was versus $30 per liter is what the actual cost was. And if the market was structured such that you actually had to pay what the true market value or cost for that water was, then maybe, you think about it, lawmakers and politicians and municipalities could get quite innovative with the way they could redistribute or I should say almost decentralize the cost of their infrastructure, their centralized infrastructure, and subsidize all these small homes moving to rainwater harvesting systems, right? I think that's where we're going. Like, in order for these urban centers to transition, we're almost saying, first, we need to charge what water actually costs. And secondly, the market would actually support probably subsidizing all these urban centers, all these small little houses converting to decentralized solutions such as rainwater and solar too, because I think all of these principles we're talking about, even though it's rainwater, would apply to solar panels as well.
So, agree totally, Michelle, but I'm prompted to unpack some things that confuse everyone. Cost is not price, is not value. They're three different things. What the utility charges for water, their usage charge, if they have a usage charge, it's a price. What it costs you and what it costs them, one way or another, is the cost. And is often confused in the discussion and rhetoric around all sorts of alternatives. The cost and price are always confused. The price is highly subsidized, and you're paying other ways by different taxes, so on in society, that hides the true cost. And sometimes that the cost is quite surprising. But value is a different thing again. So there was a really nice paper published in Nature this year by my colleagues pointing this out around water resources. The cost is not the price, and it's definitely not the value. There are three different concepts. So the price is an artificial, partial cost that is charged to consumers. The rest of the full costs, consumers are paying indirectly via all sorts of processes, usually via taxes. And the value is something quite different again. So what is the value of water? So if you are saving water in your house and you're in the top of the catchment, say you're 100 kilometres away from where water's distributed from, if it was distributed centrally, what are you actually doing? We proved this in some publications that we won awards for last year, and we've got one on its way to Nature now, is you're actually reducing the operating costs of the utility. And there you're reducing the taxes that are actually, or other types of government mechanisms that are actually recovering the full costs of supplying this subsidized water to you that's not fully covered by your price. And these two things create this perverse outcome around the house you're talking about, Michelle, because people are saying they're relating what water costs to the price they're charged by the utility, and not all the other mechanisms by society, including taxes, that you're really paying for the infrastructure of our water. And water and sewage can't be separated when you've got a centralized system. So you're actually paying for water often via your sewage charges as well. It's a very interesting dichotomy. But the value gets me out of bed in the morning. What is the value of water? It's immense, isn't it? So yes, so the value of water is getting it to your house, and you're paying for some of its value by this subsidized water price to the utility. But the way you use water changes the cost to the utility and to the state. But the way you use water and not use water changes the impacts on the environment and the energy system. Because if you take California, you can't deliver water without energy. So you, and the more you actually map this out, you realize the value of water is immense. So say you're changing the way you're using water within the watershed rather than in a more centralized way, you're returning river flows to more natural flow regimes rather than one that's highly skewed to send water to a centralized place. So you're actually changing the biodiversity and the habitat in that system, and hopefully restoring some of it. And that provides amenity and aesthetic values to humans, not to mention every other living creature. So value is a very wide concept, and economists use this concept of total economic value. So the dollar value is only a very small part of that total economic value. So I think, Michelle, my last comment is around incentive.
Yeah, and you've got me thinking too, there's another mechanism, pricing structure mechanism, that I think even makes this worse. And it's when you have a fixed base fee for delivery and an itsy bitsy per usage, per volume usage, right? Which is very common pricing structure for the utility. And, you know, we just put in a relatively large solar system on the farm, and we're not off grid. We kept our grid time. We didn't put in a battery system yet, but ironically, our power bill hasn't changed that much because most of it is the base carrying fee, right? It's the delivery charges have not changed. And I think it's the same with most water pricing schemes, water delivery pricing schemes, where a lot of that, I'm going to try and get my language right now, a lot of that cost is actually packed into the fixed fee versus the per unit. And that even makes it harder for individuals to make that decision to take on an expenditure that's going to barely change their, what they see in their pocketbook. So I believe you've done some work with a municipality in Australia, helping the regulators see the importance of challenging and changing that pricing structure. And I'd really love for you to talk a little bit about what happened and why that was so important, and what has happened as a result of that.
Absolutely, Michelle. You make a profound point. It's the same energy in water. Hopefully, when the sun comes out in Canada, there is a direct offset of energy use for your solar panels during the day, and you should get a 30 to 40% reduction in your use, because the solar energy would go straight into your use. But the people who own the market design the market to benefit themselves. And this is my point right at the beginning about commodity markets. They benefit those who design them. So if they're designed for a particular scale, say a centralized scale, and they're designed for a particular vested interest, and this is unwitting, this is no blame in this, but this is what happens repeatedly in the design of economic markets, it's obviously not going to benefit anyone else. So with electricity markets, social media, everywhere else, on a daily basis, you get this thing about, solar doesn't stack up, and we get the same here with water. Rainwater doesn't stack up, batteries don't work. So I'm actually talking to you from a house that's been running off-grid, or first off-grid with some backup from water and energy grids for a very long time. And it pays us back now $3,500 a year. So I'm walking the talk and telling you the reality is quite different. So monopoly theory 101 is the monopolists will always claim everything else doesn't work and use their market power to ensure that. So talking through that, there's a concept called natural monopoly, which means the centralized scale is the only scale that can provide the solution efficiently because no other scale can. That's known as a natural monopoly. But what we found with energy and water, that's really only a regulatory monopoly, because the regulators of markets have set the rules such that access and viability and ability to compete from alternatives, like Michelle's example of the rainwater harvesting house, they can't compete with the regulated monopoly because it's regulated to ensure the viability of one big player. So there could be very clever management, because what we discovered, we discovered that more than 80% of the costs of energy and water utilities was actually operational variable costs. The argument in regulatory space is all of their costs are fixed, so therefore you need to have fixed charges. When we examined that further around water, we actually found that if you removed all these fixed charges, which were up to 80% in some cases of people's water bills, household water bills, you actually changed the incentive and you rewarded people for actually being sustainable and making wise choices around water. But when we analyze that from a whole systems perspective without making these market assumptions that are made to simplify models, we actually found that that dramatically changed the cost of operating our utilities, their return on investment of anything, their infrastructure and their operations are almost doubled when you're incentivizing people by removing all the fixed charges to use water wisely. So what we did was quite simple. We just said there'd be only one water bill that households pay. So there wouldn't be a fixed sewage charge, wouldn't be a fixed environmental levy, wouldn't be a fixed water charge, and a half a dozen other fixed charges we have in our country, and then maybe a small usage charge for sewage and a small usage charge for water. We got rid of all of that and said there'd be one charge, and it'd be a variable charge based on your water use. Centralized water becomes centralized sewage when you think about it, because somewhere like 80% of our water use is indoor, and it goes transported all the way back by the pipes and pumps and treatment plants to the environment as waste. So we waste a lot of our water. So we changed that. Our regulator wouldn't go as far as just wiping out all of those much loved fixed charges, and I'll come back to why they're much loved. So they removed most of the fixed charges for water, and they did that this year. It was a major victory for our research, because we're certainly not mainstream water utility type researchers. So, but we do a lot of work with utilities. So our regulators in Australia changed the price of water so that the fixed charges are only very small. They're about 10% now rather than the whole lot. And the argument we made to do that is, if you actually look at the whole amount of households paying for water with the fixed charges and the usage charges, those who were water efficient were paying 3 times as much for water than those who were really wasteful with water. It was a perverse outcome of the pricing scheme. Mm-hmm. And this is also you will find the same thing for your systems in North America.
Yeah, that's the way it would work here. I think about the huge mega homes, and really, if you were to work out the cost they pay per volume compared to, somebody trying to do the right thing and save water, I'm not surprised at all to hear that the people trying to do the right thing, save water, maybe harvest a little rainwater, are paying 3 times per liter as the mega mansions, you know?
Well,
It's just so fascinating that you just change the rules in a sense, right? How never mind, you don't even have to tell everybody to go put up rainwater harvesting systems and solar panels. You just change the pricing structure. And the rules influence people's behaviors more than anything else. I can just see that as so fundamentally important to seeing the kind of changes we need.
So, Michelle, we're coming back to Donella Meadows. She had a league table of the best way to change things. Those in government and our regulators think changing the regulations and changing the pricing and changing the rules is the most effective way, but the most effective way is changing behavior.
Oh yes, because these kind of rules change behavior.
Yeah, so we're not focusing on the mechanics of how much water people are using. We're actually giving them incentive that if their behavior is different, they will benefit from it. So the outcome was, most conservative regulator in Australia changed the rules, gave citizens more incentive. And ironically, people really didn't realize that it had happened until I did some media interviews only recently here, because they're talking about they had a drought charge, and that was on all the front pages, and no one realized, because we're so indoctrinated around a very narrow way of thinking about what's possible in this space, people don't realize. So in the conversation we've just had, Michelle and Mitch, what was different in our thinking? We were focusing on the volume of people's water use. So the volume versus the total cost, which household cost, which was their price. And we just focused on that. And all of a sudden we got these answers that were quite different to everyone else. And we published them and said, the sustainable house pays 3 times as much as the house that's wasteful with water. How could this be right? And we had a lot of criticism for publishing this because the experts didn't publish this. And no criticism of others in this space, but we looked at the volume and the total amount paid by households for this service. In the past, they're going, we don't count the fixed costs. We don't count the fixed tariffs, fixed charges, because they're just fixed. So we just ignore them. And then we're manipulating like 10% of the equation by this very narrow amount of usage charges.
So if a municipality was really interested in affecting change and doing the right thing, wouldn't just changing the pricing structure of their municipal water supply be just an absolute simple way to fundamentally change the behavior and the response of the system? It's quite simple, isn't it?
It is elegant but simple.
Mm-hmm.
And what surprised me is when we did this work is that no one had done the work in the way we've done it before to show this case, because people didn't want to think that way, because we're trained as economists to think quite differently about this problem. And so we take it one step further is there was an editorial in a newspaper in Australia recently and said, myself and my colleagues had come up with a no-cost option to government of just simply change the prices, give citizens more incentive, and that sort of influence on a more incentivized market would actually get other people to contribute and be okay. I had to write back to the editor of, well, then you have to address the rules in the market that support the central supply, that basically changing the price or fully understanding it is 90% of the way. But then there would be some rules in the watershed that says people should be allowed to harvest their rainwater.
Mm.
So that you'd have to remove those anti-competitive rules from the system.
Mm-hmm.
So markets are all good, provided you've got perfect competition. But when you look at a water market from a holistic view, if your watersheds are full of all these rules that favour one type of solution over all the others, you don't have perfect competition.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you have one entity has all the information about the water and no one else does, which is where we're going in Australia. If everyone doesn't have this, everyone must have the same access and the same quality of data so everyone can make informed decisions in the market. That's two important points of market economics. If you don't have those two things, you don't have a market, a perfect market. You have an artifact, you have someone's construct. So if you change the prices, your governments actually change the rules to encourage, to allow people to do those better things. The market will then, because it's more open and more transparent, will then actually move you towards a more distributed, balanced solution. And what our research shows is everyone will be better off: the state, the utilities, and the citizens, and importantly, the environment. So, very dry topic, isn't it, economics?
Well, we could get into some rainwater tanks to be a bit more of a saturated topic. In particular, yeah, that was bad. Peter, your work has definitely highlighted a number of benefits from rainwater tanks, including demand or reductions in the demand on municipal water supplies, reductions in the cost of infrastructure, reductions in environmental impact of stormwater discharge. And other than that, we've highlighted some positive externalities of that, especially with biodiversity and maybe actually having rivers reach the end of their course and actually going to the oceans. I'm wondering if you could go through each of those in detail and perhaps go into detail about the misconceptions of rainwater, especially notably in your work. You've talked about how there are perceived health risks, and there certainly around me, there isn't much of an adoption of rainwater, whether that be either economic or people just don't find it attractive because they think they're putting their lives at risk. A lot of your work has debunked that. And could you go into detail about how awesome rainwater actually is?
Thanks, Mitch. That's a really open question, isn't it? How long are we going to be here for?
Oh, as long as it takes.
Oh, wow. Well, good thing I got a coffee. When I was doing my PhD and I decided to move to this more decentralized topic, I was looking, Australia, like all of North America, was a colony of England, and probably the Dutch and the French at different times, depending on whose history you believe. Early in the colony, they had the Rum Rebellion, which they also had in North America. And why was rum important is because England could earn taxes from rum to fund its activities in the colony. So that created a black market in rum and other alcohol, which destroyed many people's livers and lives, but we'll come back to that some other time. So basically, taxing the colony via rum and other spirits created mutinies and unrest. We had Eureka Stockade overtaxing the miners as well. You guys had the Boston Tea Party, and history teaches us a lot. The next big thing that happened, and you have to study history here to see that playing out, is, well, water's a commodity, right? Everyone needs it. The early parliaments, the colonial parliaments of this country, decided that they'll charge people for water. It's the new tax to fund the activities of the colony. And I ploughed through the early records, the early newspaper was the Sydney Morning Herald. And it's amazing history that's really not published, because it is published, but not in the mainstream in the way you think it would be, given it was so important. Why is this important to your question, Mitch? Well, everyone was using rainwater or river water or well water in this colony. And the rainwater storages were pig iron tanks that came out on sailing ships, but in our coastal environment, they corroded a lot. So people had a lot of iron in their diet, which isn't so bad compared to other heavy metals. So people wouldn't use the government's water, because it was rubbish too, by the way. They would put in a pipe from the local river, and it wouldn't get to most houses, but they wanted every property to pay a fixed charge for access to this water that either didn't exist or did exist in a very poor state. And that was our history. Or it was full of sewage and it made people sick. So we didn't understand back then that mixing sewage and water actually killed people, which was the beginning of the misconceptions around alternatives. So it came to a head in a place called Newcastle, where I live, where the Hunter Acts of Parliament created this Hunter water and sewage scheme. It wasn't called Hunter, it was called something different. I can't remember now. Nevertheless, people refused to use it. The colonial government borrowed money from England to build a rudimentary transfer scheme of water from the Hunter River. But people said, no, we're not paying it. We've got our rainwater, or we've got our well water, or we've got our own river water that we're using ourselves. So we had Acts of Parliament and lots of rhetoric by the very conservative Sydney Morning Herald around these dirty people in the city who can't possibly wash because they're not using the government's water. So hence started the rhetoric around any other water than those sold to you by the government arrangements were second rate and dirty and so on. And then they tried, and this is in the 1800s, tried to actually say that the people using their rainwater storages had really poor health because of the coal dust, because we were a mining community back then, lots of coal in Australia. But that wasn't the case either. And there's early reports from medical practitioners saying, yes, the government keeps saying this, but people aren't sick. But there were massive outbreaks of typhoid, ironically, from the centralized supply because it was mixed with sewage. And there was also typhoid outbreaks from people's wells, because if you put the cesspit for the sewage in your backyard and that seeped into the groundwater below, and over here you've got a well you're drawing the water out, obviously you got this direct connection with the sewage waste, and you were, as you did in the river system with untreated water transported by the government. So we had massive outbreaks of typhoid. But back then they didn't know that dirty water, quote unquote, actually made you sick. So fast forward 200 years, we need to tax water. We need to find a mechanism to do that. And we need to say everything else is unsafe and unclean, which is a marketing strategy people use all the time for different products, of our product's better than yours. Economics 101, actually set up this narrative around rainwater is really bad. But what it's really saying since over 200 years ago is rainwater is competition to earning the tax from the government investment in water infrastructure. Now, that's an unfortunate dichotomy, because our research has shown that if you have both rainwater harvesting and a well-constructed and managed centralized supply, they both work together as a system to make the best possible outcomes in terms of economy and environment. So that mixture of small and big together is actually highly optimum. It's a really good outcome. So it's not a competition, but the competition was set more than 200 years ago. And that was transferred in the rhetoric to North America as well. And it's embedded in the thinking of some. It's embedded in the way even economics is taught, having done an economics degree, that if you do the little bit on water, you're taught that centralized work and nothing else works, even in the rhetoric of teaching economics at universities. That's quite unfortunate. So that's why we're doing so much work to try and change the way we understand these things. So getting to the quality of rainwater, now that you've got the history, some of it, it's always been claimed that all these people were sick and dying or ill from rainwater. The reality is there's less than a handful of cases of that happening in Australia. It's so the rhetoric versus the truth is actually very different. But the rhetoric is always published in the mainstream journals. So if someone like me publishes, well, hang on, I've gone through the data and actually looked at the facts, and there's not much of this going on at all, actually, no one's sick. It's very difficult to publish it because it seemed to be quite opposite to the conventional wisdom, but we get our stuff published. In the 90s and the early 2000s, a lady named Jane Hayworth did a couple of health studies in Australia, and she looked at 6-year-old and below children of drinking untreated rainwater versus drinking municipal water supplies, treated water. The first study showed the children were actually healthier from drinking the untreated rainwater than the utility supply. And that caused a fair bit of outrage and affected Jane's career somewhat, I think. And so she did another study with more conservative people around her, and they basically found the same result again. So a decade later, one of our most conservative universities' health department teamed up with the central health departments and some utilities and said, "Oh, we'll do this again because we know that can't be right." And this time they tested treated rainwater versus untreated rainwater in a double-blind study. And this is Shelley Rodriguez and her colleagues. And they actually found there was no difference between treated rainwater and untreated rainwater for people's health impacts. And basically around gastrointestinal illness, you couldn't tell the difference between people on a mains water utility supply and those on an untreated rainwater supply. So since then, I've been collating these studies. There's something like 17 of them around the world. And they're quite unique, and you don't hear about them a lot, although they're very significant pieces of epidemiology research, so health studies. And they always show that there's no difference between the health of people on untreated rainwater and not. So, but hang on, the big scary stories are, there'll be some sort of pathogen in your rainwater, therefore you're at high risk of illness. Let's unpack that for a moment. Where would that pathogen come from? Say if it's a classic Australian system, so it's a roof harvest system. I've got some golden retrievers in the background having a bark. So if you've got an above ground rainwater tank and a roof, water flows from the roof to the tank Where do the pathogens come from? What is a pathogen? Bacteria is not a pathogen. So bacteria is not a pathogen. People confuse pathogens with bacteria. I'm going to have to silence these dogs.
Yeah. We'll wait for you. No problem. Oh, Mitch, you're on mute.
I was just saying I'm muted, so I'm not actually saying anything, but I do have things to say. This book, we have a special code actually available for anyone who wants to buy it in the next 3 days. It's going to be 20% off with the following discount code. And I just want to get everyone more engaged in the chat, get more questions going, because the most engaged viewer, it will get a free copy of the book either sent to them via ebook or through mail if they are in North America.
And do we have a few questions to make sure we save time for Mitch?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are there's a couple questions for sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So sorry about that.
Dogs will be dogs.
So with the price versus value versus cost dichotomy we talked about before, Michelle, it's the same thing of bacteria and pathogens are not the same, and they're interchanged always in the rhetoric. So when you come to rainwater harvesting, there are a lot of environmental bacteria that are quite good for us in low doses and have a positive effect on rainwater systems. If you wrongly assume that all bacteria are pathogens, you're in dangerous territory with rainwater harvesting, and that's been a common mistake. Also, our research has discovered the treatment train, which I'll come back to, and the good bacteria plays a very important part in the treatment train. The other thing is molecular sciences around DNA, which we pioneered moving DNA techniques from medical sciences into the water industry nearly 20 years ago to work out what was really going on in rainwater harvesting, showed us that most of the bacteria that was being claimed to be pathogens was simply harmless environmental bacteria. There were more than 30 species of E. coli, for example, that have got no relationship to poo. They simply exist in the environment, and they don't indicate fecal contamination of water, and therefore they don't indicate a risk of potential pathogens in the water. So did you just hear what I said? Even if you got E. coli as an indicator bacteria in water, that's not a pathogen. It's indicating there might be a pathogen in the water because there might be poo in the water. However, given that more than 30, just pick on E. coli for a moment, and that's a more refined bacteria for indicating possible fecal contamination, given that more than 30 of those species actually are just simply environmental origin and nothing to do with fecal or poo contamination, that's also misleading. And that's one of our best indicators we've been using. So in a mains water system that's fully enclosed, finding a bunch of E. coli in that enclosed pipe system, and you're supplying millions of people, you'd be conservative, wouldn't you, and say, yeah, well, we need to manage that. If you've got a rainwater system that's only supplying maybe 4 people in one house, the risk profile is completely different, and it doesn't actually lend itself to this overly conservative approach, the very risk-averse approach. With rainwater systems, you're directly interfacing with environmental waters, and they'll have environmental bacteria, mostly harmless to us. Our best indicator tests rely on environmental organisms to tell us there might be fecal contamination. They actually don't directly measure fecal contamination. They measure sets of environmental organisms, like the total coliform test, to suggest there might be fecal contamination. So if your major tests in microbiology are actually using environmental bacteria as an indicator that there might be fecal contamination, you know, something that's come from a gut of an animal or a human in the water, you're always going to get very highly negative results for the quality of rainwater. So that was a big discovery of ours. The other issue is there's the concept of the treatment train. So water flows off the roof through leaf diverters, perhaps, maybe a first flush device, through mesh screens, into your storage. Your storage is actually a bioreactor. That was our discovery. The sludge on the bottom is actually a biofilm, and it's highly beneficial at cleaning water, not making it worse. If you don't have the biofilm, your water stored water will have a lesser quality. And you can't see it in most cases, but on the walls of your storage, there is also a biofilm. Biofilm is like a slime, and it's highly beneficial to keep the water clean. And then the water passes through your pump, if you have a pump, and your pump has got very fine screens on the inlet and the outlet. And we also discovered that the pressure change in a pump actually kills bacteria, because bacteria don't like changes in temperature, in pressure. Then we also discovered, and it was a genuine new discovery that will change textbooks, that no, you don't need water heated to 100 degrees Celsius to actually change the bacterial content. We actually found that the temperature of domestic hot water services was such that they eliminated the majority of any leftover residual potentially harmful bacteria in rainwater. So low heat systems, and that was a good discovery. And that was done with storage hot water systems. And they said, oh, well, instantaneous ones can't work, because this sort of narrow way of thinking. But we actually found the opposite in the field, in a laboratory, and it stumped us for a while, and we found out why. The heat energy used in an instantaneous hot water system is not 55 degrees, for example. It's probably 200 degrees Celsius to get water to change from, say, 10 degrees to, say, 45 degrees or 50 degrees, however hot you want to make your water. So it's the heat energy and the changes of temperature at low heat that actually were killing the bacteria as well. So we discovered a treatment train. Sorry, I banged on for a long time, Mitch. Sorry about that.
No, and I think this is a perfect time to say that, you know, if you're interested in learning more about rainwater harvesting and the rainwater harvesting treatment train and how to set up your system for quality water and how to size your system, in about 3 weeks' time, Peter, Mitch and I, all three of us are embarking on a 10-week course where we're going to get on weekly live webinars with all the students to answer your questions. And there's also 10 modules. There's a whole ton of content that we've recorded and we've prepared for you. And we're really excited about launching this next course. So Mitch, make sure you put the link to that. But in addition to that, because it might not be a fit for everyone and we really want this information out there, we've prepped what we're calling the Essential Rainwater Harvesting Taste Tester, and we're releasing a good 10% of the course for free. So you can actually access some of the best lessons and some of the best content and the most important stuff as well for free, for no cost. And Mitch is also going to put the link for our course taste test as well in the chat. And then I'm wondering if we should just use the last, we've been going on for about an hour and 15 minutes. If we were to do 15 minutes or questions, would that help our audience who showed up? Oh, Mitch, you're still muted. Yeah.
Do this every time. I was just thinking that you guys are the conductors of the treatment train. That's something you can add to the end of your email signature, Peter.
I think you got to work on
Hey,
your puns there, Mitch, for the course. You're gonna get a list.
you're going to pay for Mitch's humor too. So it's an important point though. Conductors of the treatment train, but we'll show you how the treatment train fits in with the language that the regulators use around rainwater harvesting. So very conservative from the perspective of centralized suppliers. You've got rules or guidance around rainwater harvesting about log reductions in particular types of constituents in rainwater. And people would be wondering, how do I manage that, given these guys are talking about the treatment train? Well, actually, we'll talk you through how to have that conversation and how to compare with how the rules are made in your jurisdictions about rainwater harvesting versus how the science works. They're actually not different things. It's just a different conversation.
Mm-hmm. All right. So am I muted again? Nope. Okay. I'm gonna go fishing for some questions for both of you. Happy Hobbit is asking, what can be done in the winter with snow to harvest water?
Roof harvested. I'm going to stick to. Well, of course, there's landscape water harvesting with snow and snow fences, which Rob talks about a lot, and I'm sure he has YouTube videos on it. But I'm going to stick to rainwater harvesting with the intent of capturing, ultimately water in a tank for use indoors. There are some good examples of cold climate rainwater harvesting for indoor use, but not very many, not near enough, and that's something we're hoping to change. If you are going to be in a cold climate and try and harvest snow off your roof, you've got some additional considerations you've got to keep in mind related to your gutters and some snow rails. And I think there's some innovation that's needed, and that's what I can say there. There's innovation in terms of maybe heating, designing your roof. There's some thinking you would want to put into it, designing your roof, maybe to be cycling some of your hot air up into a roof cavity so you could melt that snow and turn it into water so you could ultimately harvest it. What have you seen, Peter? I know you actually do have snowy areas in Australia where they're harvesting snow and turning it into rainwater.
I think the beauty of doing this in North America, you've got some, like we do in Australia, you've got some interesting and different challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them are insurmountable. They're all interesting. In our last course, our beta course, we had people, each student did their own rainwater design, and we had a fascinating conversation from people from all over North America and someone from South Africa, I think, from memory. And a few did their snow harvesting systems. And we worked on years ago in our snowy mountains here, and we don't have snow like you guys. In some snowfield chalets, a rainwater harvesting system, because they want to make them sustainable. In their case, they had very steep roofs where there's the rainwater and then the snow slid off the roofs, wasn't caught in gutters, because as a structural engineer, you would know that would be quite a load problem to deal with. And it fell into a ground-based gutter system, a trough. And as it melted, it flowed into their rainwater harvesting system. So it was this was in the chalets in Falls Creek. They would actually design the rainwater harvesting system with snow in mind. And I believe you could do that in Canada, and in fact, in North America. And in fact, I think some of our our colleagues in our last course, Michelle, came up with some really good ideas around that.
Yeah, absolutely. We spent quite some time looking at different designs. But yeah, I'd say, and it really does depend on your situation, and are you actually trying to convert that snow into, water that you can harvest and collect. And take somewhere like in our climate where we actually do get a freeze melt cycle, quite a good freeze melt cycle. So we don't accumulate large volumes of snow on our roofs. Typically we get a little bit of snow and then it warms up and it kind of melts. So you might have different considerations for that kind of a situation than you would in, say, I'm thinking Revelstoke is a city that comes to mind in the British Columbia mountains, where, oh my gosh, I think they can get 6 meters of maybe 6 meters, 6 feet. Sorry.
6 meters. Wow, Michelle.
Yeah, I'm bilingual, but sometimes I do mess them up. 6 feet of accumulated snow, and that's a different consideration altogether, where you might be looking at using heat energy or using electrical energy. But then again, yeah, every situation you'd probably have your own design criteria, because then what's your cost, and you've got all these things to figure out, right?
So it's site-based design, though, isn't it? Every site is unique. Mm-hmm. We had one couple in our beta course who were using some of their excess solar energy to warm up their rainwater room. Mm-hmm. That was also melting the snow. That was an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Back to economics. Could you explain how the trading of water on the market could impact our own private lives?
Certainly. Trading of water will do a number of things in a market that's not a pure market and it's not regulated in the right way. It will, one, change the price of every other good. Everything on earth is dependent on water, particularly your food products. And two, such a commodities market will drive a process where utilities will have to actually pay to get water from the market to on-sell it to consumers. So that will also drive up the price of water supplies to urban areas. So those two things will happen pretty soon, unless there are other government processes in place. It will also drive the search for large projects around water that may or may not generate water that can be sold in the market, or large projects around large land holdings would have water rights attached to them, that those water rights could be separated from land, which has happened in Australia. The markets drove that. And the water can be sold separate to the land, so you result in lots of land in your watershed that has no water rights because the water is more valuable than the land. So there are things to watch out for. Mm-hmm. How that can be mitigated is by the state. Well, the question is, who's going to own this water market? Because markets are often presented to people as being magic, but they're not. Someone has to own a market. Someone has to regulate it. And regulation of a market should be more than just a stock exchange where they're managing the buying and selling of the product. There needs to be a government regulatory process that sets the rules of how the market works and intervenes probably regularly in the first 5 years of trading to keep nudging the market in the direction where they need it to go. So I'd be very interested to see how that will evolve. So increase in prices of commodities makes us think about how much everything else is dependent on water. Everything from manufacturing cars all the way through to buying watermelons. You have watermelons in North America?
Yes. Only in the summertime, though.
Yeah, same here, only in the summer.
That's actually a good segue to the next question is who determines the value of water? So a little bit of an anecdote here too. This person's saying, decades ago, we started conserving water. Then the water company that delivers it raised their prices because we used less. What point in the supply chain is value determined?
Well, it's a good story because this is related to my long-winded discussion earlier on. From the narrow perspective of the water company, they're managing value just by the quantum of revenue. They're not counting the cost reductions in supplying water by supplying less. They're just only counting the quantum of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're only counting how much revenue you're earning from water, saving water is something you don't want to do because, or other people supplying water, because it's reducing your quantum of revenue. So you'll be saying you need to increase the price of water so I can earn more revenue. But if you're doing your economics properly and saying, yes, we supplied 10% less water at peak times because peak has changed, therefore we have to supply less infrastructure and our operating costs go down. You know, the cost to run the pumps, the water treatment plants, the sewage treatment plants, they're the big cost items in running a utility. If they reduce, the cost base of the utility reduces. But what happened in my country is that is never counted. It's just those cost bases assumed to be fixed. And so it gets down to a very narrow accounting of it just increase the price so we can earn more revenue. So increasing the price is okay if it's total usage charges and there are no fixed charges. But if the price is just increased and you still have this big quantum of fixed charges, it's not very fair, is it?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking when you were having that discussion about what if everyone just started having rainwater harvesting systems and all of a sudden the demand for it is so diluted that those who didn't have rainwater harvesting systems, their prices would skyrocket because the utility had to justify actually having a money coming in to actually justify having all of this infrastructure.
So it's a really good point. That's the argument in my country. But then you say to the utility that your costs are dramatically reduced. You're not building desal plants, you're not building more massive wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants, and you're building a lot less infrastructure. But also your day-to-day operating costs are dramatically reduced. The reality is, and I'm just about to publish this research in a big journal, but we've published it over here a lot, is it goes the other way. 20 years of economic history have shown this in our country, that the cost base goes down for the utility if everyone becomes water efficient and uses less water. It doesn't go up. They, of course, looking after their own interests, are saying, no, our cost base, we need to earn more revenue, and the argument is only around revenue.
Yeah.
But the question before that, Mitch and Michelle, was about value. And we haven't talked about value here at all because this is a very, very narrow component of the value water brings to us.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to share water carefully because it has value to everyone.
Absolutely. Question on rainwater tank. What is your view on open with a mesh top or sealed water containers?
I think all inlets and outlets to a rainwater storage should have fine mesh, and that will solve many of your problems. There's been confusion between, say, lakes and rivers and algae and rainwater storages who don't have that nutrient content to grow algae. in the literature, and this is something Michelle and I talk a lot about in the course, and you too now, Mitch, is there's a lot of assumptions in the rainwater harvesting industry are taken from different areas of science and without too much thinking have just been applied to rainwater harvesting. This is one for sure. The bit of light in your rainwater storage is fine because it's not full of algae and it's not stagnant and it's moving, or it's not full of nutrients that would support growing algae. So
And I'll just add that you absolutely don't want, you want your tank to breathe. You don't want a sealed tank. You absolutely want oxygen and air to be able to freely enter and leave the tank.
Cool.
and our research showed that, Mitch, we found tanks that were completely sealed and didn't breathe actually produced worse water quality because they become anaerobic.
Mm-hmm.
So they were oxygen depleted, and then you actually get some release of toxins that you wouldn't want, that wouldn't naturally occur.
Yeah. This next question comes from when we were talking about water futures and water commodities. And Bark Artist is asking, in a nightmare scenario, doesn't that give global governments to how we manipulate our private property in terms of key line, etc.? So I think maybe what it's getting at is what do we do if we store that water, if we're in the top of the catchment? What if we store it in our land and the government owns it?
Well, North America inherits its legal system from England the same as Australia does. And way before colonies were formed, the concepts of riparian rights in law were already established. There's sure to be lots of conversations about this, but and you don't want to involve too many lawyers, but basically the state doesn't own the rain. My understanding of your legal system is that the same applies to your inherited legal system too. If the rain falls on your property, right, and it's not owned by you, so you don't do anything about it, and that water races off and floods your neighbor, therefore, based on the logic that some would try and make, the state is responsible if you flood your neighbor. You're not. You understand this? This is why governments here backed away from it, because they realized immediately what sort of class actions they were going to be open to. If you own the water that falls on your land, which is what you probably do within limits of not unreasonably restricting your neighbor from rights to water, and that's a long conversation, but there's like 500 years of water law around this that both our countries inherited. So you've got reasonable use of water that falls on your land and reasonable management of it. They use reasonable a lot in law, keeps the lawyers rich. So you get fairly sensible outcomes. But if you go the other way, which is the rhetoric we're hearing sometimes, basically the state is responsible for everything. And so when flooding happens, the property next to you, because of you can't touch the water because the state says you can't touch it because they own it, the state has to pay compensation to the people who are flooded. And you can see why they backed away from this when they took it all the way to our High Court in Australia to say, no, the state owns the water because the state owns the water monopolies. So they're wanting to say no one else has rights to this water except for the state. Well, it didn't work. So you could go the other way if there's all sorts of really odd outcomes if you assume that the state owns the rain or the water that falls on your property. I've given you a few of them.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. Pajama Bin Smarter is asking, wouldn't untreated rainwater be a huge gamble? If a bird perches on the roof and defecates, would it not be unsafe?
I'd say You better sign up for the taste tester.
You should come to the course, but higher order mammals are the source of 99.9% of our so-called pathogens. So Cryptosporidium from a bird is harmless to us. Cryptosporidium from a cow, say Milwaukee, for example, that strain is quite harmful to humans. I think you had 400,000 people in the mains water supply system in Milwaukee became ill because of Cryptosporidium from calves. So if a cow is not standing on your roof defecating, the chances of the right type of Cryptosporidium getting in your water supply is actually quite remote. However, there are some illnesses from birds, and you need to sign up for the course. We'll take you all the way through it. But most of the bacteria that are secondary in terms of risk that might be in bird poo are very fragile. They don't like light. They don't like any sort of UV light from sunlight. They don't like drying. And defecating on a roof from a bird versus getting all the way through the system into your rainwater storage because of the natural treatment train means that, quite rightly, the majority of people around in our country don't have any major problems from birds. But you need to do the course, and we'll talk you through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we are talking, when Peter talks untreated rainwater, what he means by untreated is there's no chlorination or no UV at the end of the line, like what is currently prescribed by the most North American codes and standards say you must have UV sterilization of your rainwater. We argue that there's actually all these interventions of a well-designed rainwater system that form a natural treatment train.
And that's the confusion.
Mm-hmm.
It was deliberate, the use of untreated. It came from our utilities. So it gives the perception, if you don't treat rainwater harvesting, if it's a city's water supply with wastewater and water treatment plants and that sort of centralized large-scale thinking, it's not treated. And the thing we'll talk you through is, as Michelle quite rightly pointed out, that the confusion between utility water supply and rainwater harvesting in determining whether or not something's treated is something we need to understand and talk about. So the treatment train, the natural treatment train in rainwater harvesting has a range of interventions. So please sign up and we'll teach you about it.
Or at least take the taste tester, because there's a little bit in there too. So
yeah, quite a bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I guess it's sort of related, but is the layer of sediment in the bottom of the tank a worry?
It's actually a good thing. It helps improve the quality of the rainwater. It's a biofilm. There's been, and I'll explain it in the course, there's been some work that's tried to claim that this is harmful, but it isn't harmful. It's the biofilm draws contaminants and other bacteria, and the biofilm is a city of bacteria. Mm-hmm. It eats whatever's in the water column to clean water to make it better. So as long as you stay away from that biofilm and you don't disturb it, you will have better quality rainwater.
Mm-hmm. This question might be more geared for Michelle. So there's a couple questions about cold climate rainwater harvesting. So how do you keep your rainwater from freezing? And would indoor tanks at room temperature store water in good condition for a longer time? Okay, I need to take a look at this question again so I make sure it's correct. Would indoor tanks at room temperature store water in good condition for a longer time so long as the treatment train is used?
I'm going to answer the second one first. So yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then as for the first question in terms of freeze protection for tanks in cold climates, yes, absolutely. You need to provide some form of freeze protection. And there's lots of different ways to do that. It's site specific. One of the more common ways, it's a little bit more capital intensive up front, but is cheaper from an operational perspective, is to bury your tank. So, you know, you almost have to best to plan that in, dig a big hole, put your tank underground, because then you benefit from the 4 degrees Celsius ground temperature and your water's not going to freeze. The same idea as a septic tank, right? We on rural farms and acreages where the tanks are buried below ground and they don't freeze down there. It's the same thing with your rainwater system. You could also possibly do a little bit of heat. There's a couple of different ways to do that, but those of course would have operational costs. So it would be, you'd have to really think through if that made sense for you to do it that way. Mm-hmm. I do think the best solution is upfront planning and putting in a cistern or a tank in the basement or underground. And I think of my grandmother's homestead in northern Saskatchewan. And when I would go visit when I was a young child, my mother grew up in this home as well. There was an actual room in the basement, a cinder block wall. And that room was for rainwater storage year round. Mm-hmm. And my mom remembers swimming in it. That's kind of an aside, a little bit of a funny story, but yeah, and you can find homes like that, especially in the prairies where, you know, these homes were built and they had to be off grid, and that's what they did.
Cool.
So I should say, I'm looking at the time. I know I have to scoot. I have probably another 5 minutes. Maybe Mitch, if there's another question.
I mean, there are a couple questions. I certainly have heaps of questions, but I can always just call you Michelle.
We could do this again. I mean, I know Peter's always game.
Yeah, Peter, how much time do you have?
I'm in your hands, guys. So we could do it again, and we could have more structure. If you've got a lot of leftover questions, let's do it again.
Let's do one more. Let's do one more question, and you got to do the book prize too, right?
Yep. So unfortunately, the person who I chose left, so they aren't getting it anymore. But I do have a question that I ask all my guests at the end. So this one will go to both of you. So hypothetical situation. You are made the education minister of your country, and you need to pick 3 books for every high school graduate to read. Which ones are they and why? And Michelle, you go first.
Oh, you're gonna put me on the spot like that, Mitch? For high school students?
Just finished high school, just, you know, confused, don't know where to go,
okay.
What to do.
Well, the first one is the book that Peter recommended to me, so I wonder if it's going to be on his list too. It's Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. That was a fabulous book, and I think just systems thinking in general. Can I just give one? I think to keep it simple, teaching more thinking in wholes. How do we view things in and understand that all these elements are connected? Because fundamentally that's permaculture thinking as well. Permaculture is a systems design approach, right? So yeah, thinking in systems is an excellent primer to this idea of whole systems design and whole systems thinking. And that ties a lot to a lot of the stuff we talked about today, actually. Yeah.
Awesome.
Peter, your turn.
Well, you stole my thunder with thinking in systems, because I would certainly recommend that. There's a little Nature paper published this year by my friend Quinton Grafton and about 20 others about the difference between cost, price, and value. It's quite well written. It's understandable as well for an economics paper. So beyond thinking in systems, I would have people to read that, because we need to understand the value of things, which is different to the price of them. There would be a number of books. I'm a bit bookish, so I would be recommending all sorts of things. But there was a book published that is timeless called Small is Beautiful, that is quite challenging in our modern world of being increasingly globalized and centralized. But I think it's also timely that we might need to get back and read a book like that. So it's got the world and value is what we make it. It doesn't magically happen from the top down. So I'll stick to one book too, because you took my first choice.
So thinking in systems and small is beautiful. Awesome. Well, Jamie Smith, send me an email at mitch@vergepermaculture.ca and we'll hook you up with one of these. And thank you guys so much. And it would be great to have another chit chat and maybe have more questions. We can field some more questions from different people around the world who are watching and want to know more, because
we could be more specific about rainwater harvesting systems. I think this one was fascinating because we talked about all the big picture, the commodity trading of water and the systems principles, but just down to the gritty, the people's questions, common questions on rainwater harvesting systems. Let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome.
Okay, well then stay tuned.
Thank you so much, guys, and
enjoy the snow, you guys.
Oh yeah, thank you, Peter. Enjoy the beach and your dogs.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.